Thank you so much, Grace. It's a real honor to be here. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Again, as noted, Amina McNulty. I am a design research and urban planning consultant, and I've been leading this research initiative. And I'm so excited to share a little bit about what we found and observed and really start to get into some of the questions and conversations we're excited to have. So I'm going to turn it over, excuse me, to my colleague Nick to start us off, and looking forward to hearing more from all of you.
Thanks, Ami. I'm going to share my screen here so we can get the slides up. Uh, we all good there? Grace, Ami? In full screen? Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
So thanks everyone for joining us. Yeah, Nick Jabs. I'm gonna dive in here and just talk a little bit about this project. So this is a project, this research was really born out of our practice. We were working on four projects that on the surface look like they all might be the same, about 80-acre park projects in charismatic landscapes in various parts of the country. But each one of them was funded in a completely different way and managed in a completely different way. So we were kind of just like working on these and we're like, what is going on? Like was public space in the United States kind of like conceived of and executed in entirely different ways? So we have really good relationship with the folks at the University of Pennsylvania and the McCard Center, and they really facilitated this research project with support from Port. So we started digging. We started digging into this question about how public space, how parks and public space in the United States get made. And as happens when you start digging, you unearth more questions than you answer. So what started as a sort of very simple line of inquiry kind of snowballed into a whole series of questions. Where does the fund, what are the mechanisms by which these places are funded? Is there a relationship between where the funding comes from and how the city governance is structure is set up? What kind of agency does the Parks Department or the entity that manages public space have in those kinds of places? And what are the implications for how public space is made? So the result of that, this is sort of a 2-year research project that is it's in some ways a snapshot in time. This uses data from 2023, so some of the stuff may not be totally current in terms of like the city budgets and things like that. And all the information we pulled about the case studies that we'll talk about were from sources that were publicly available. So this is a research project, a 2-year research project that resulted in the set of 64 cards. And the cards are a way for us to facilitate some of this discussion. So the research is a national survey of public space projects, projects all across the country, with the goal really of supporting local implementation efforts. As I mentioned, it is a tool for facilitating discussions, like the discussions like we're having here today between MICD as a nonprofit, us as design professionals and academics and researchers, and you all as elected officials and city administrators. We also have found that's a great tool for us to facilitate discussions within the profession, landscape architecture, planning, architecture communities, and hopefully creating stewards and for this kind of work. And finally, we see this as a project that is potentially a framework for you all to ask strategic questions about projects, about either upcoming projects that you're trying to develop or even your past projects to understand maybe a little bit more about the relationship between some of these questions. So the study looked at 9 different cities, kind of across 3 latitudes and a range of cities. A lot of them are sort of mid-sized cities, and they include legacy industrial cities, Sunbelt cities, coastal cities, Midwest cities. We tried to capture a range in this study, and these are the 9 cities that we chose across these 3 latitudes. And then we looked at 3 different types of projects. So the first type of project we call signature projects. And these projects are, like high profile projects in cities. They oftentimes have high budgets, so don't get scared when we show, for example, the first project that we're going to talk about. And they are destinations that not only serve local audiences, but also attract regional and tourist audiences as well. The second type of project that we looked at are connective projects. And these are linear or corridor projects. They often are things like greenways that connect two or more neighborhoods. These projects have a range of budgets and are unique in that they require the coordination of multiple jurisdictions, not just one city, but also counties, advocacy groups, et cetera, stuff like that. And they're similar but different to signature projects in that they do serve local and regional audiences, but usually when connecting to larger trail networks or destination type spaces or venues. And finally, we looked at neighborhood type projects. So these are often smaller projects near residential areas that serve a local audience. We chose projects that have a mix of site amenities, and these projects often have more modest budgets. So across these three types of projects, we chose one project in each city. So there's a total of 27 projects, case study projects in the study. There's a huge range of characteristics, particularly as it relates to the cost or the capital stack. And again, I don't want to scare anyone. The first project will have the highest budget in the study, but they go all the way down to $200,000 projects that are neighborhood scale. And we'll touch on kind of all of these types in this presentation. So the first set of projects we want to talk today about are the signature projects. And we're going to start with Clyde Warren Park in Dallas, Texas. This project is interesting and instructive for a couple of reasons. The first is that the creation of the public space project, which is a 5.4 acre park, a deck park that's spanning over a freeway, is highly linked to two things. One is transit improvements, and two is real estate investments. This is not exactly surprising. Many of the projects that we looked at have similar drivers for them. Including like Dilworth Park in Philadelphia, which is a great example of a plaza around City Hall, but is very highly tied to public transit improvements. Another thing that's interesting about Clyde Warren is that it's the real estate community that really came up with the idea of capping the highway for public use and in order to boost development and adjacent real estate values. So local business stakeholders formed the Woodall Rogers Foundation in 2004 and managed the fundraising, design, and construction of the project. So maybe not surprisingly then, the capital stack for this project is almost exactly a 50-50 split between public funding and private investment. The role of transit agencies becomes clear when you see that over $36 million worth of the funding came from state and federal level DOTs, but also a sizable bond measure was passed backed by the general fund and public grants to round out the public funding. As mentioned, a large philanthropic initiative led by the Woodall Rogers Foundation provided 50% of the funding. So a couple other things to note. The foundation here also manages the park operations and programming, which is with funding support from the Dallas Arts District Public Improvement District. So the presence of this management organization has been one of the key to the park's ongoing success. We should also recognize that Dallas-Fort Worth region has a culture of investing in a culture of private philanthropic investment in outdoor public spaces. So that's part of the reason that there's so much support for this on the private side. And I think just to pause for a moment, it's a good reminder that each of the projects that we're going to look at really is a reflection of the local context. So in this case, real estate, highway transportation, outdoor-oriented philanthropy. I mean, I think these things really say something about the Dallas-Fort Worth region. So this is just, so in this project example, I want to call your attention to the black circles that are down in the bottom right-hand corner of the card. These symbols are for the funding mechanisms that were used to make up the capital stack. Again, in this case, the general funds, the public grants, municipal bonds, and philanthropy. So this is another one of our, we call them decks of cards. The case studies are a deck of cards. We call this the glossary deck. And really what it is a way for us to set the terms of the project. And I won't read, Yeah, I won't read all of these here, but they included these different funding mechanisms include like the general fund, development fees, special districts, public grants, and these are all the different ways that we saw across the 27 projects that funding was used to kind of create the capital stacks. And we'll touch on, I think, all of them, or if not all of them, most of them in the 9 case studies that we're going to talk about today. So the second signature project is Martin's Park in Boston. This is, we refer to it internally as a kind of a heartstrings project. It was born out of the tragic Boston Marathon bombing in 2013. And it really is a public-private collaboration between the city of Boston and the Martin Richards Association, and various private donors. The result of it is a 1-acre park that emphasizes accessible play and resilient solutions for the Seaport District. Two things to note here. First, the project happened because of local champions driving it forward. This is super critical. There were very dedicated, very strong people who were driving this project forward. And it was, their dedication and motivation and their relationships and frankly, their access to resources that helped make this project happen. But the importance of local champions cannot be understated. And the second, the private endowment that was established for this project was established specifically for long-term maintenance of the project. So this is the only project in our study where philanthropic money was dedicated for long-term maintenance rather than just the upfront capital costs, which is really one of the keys to why this project has been so successful in Boston. And similar to the last one, the capital stack looks very different. There's a lot of different inputs here as opposed to just a few. But I think that's again a reflection of the local context and the sort of the story of the project. So philanthropy played a big role in this project, including a high number of donations that were under $25,000. That made up a big chunk of the money here. So there are also numerous public funding sources that came together, including $500,000 from the Community Preservation Fund, which is a dedicated tax in the Boston area. The last signature project that we're going to talk about is Historic Fourth Ward Park in Atlanta. One of the things that I think is notable about this project relative to the other two is that it is closely aligned with water-related infrastructure improvements. So this was a community-driven solution to the city's stormwater management needs that also dealt with previously industrial land that probably had some contamination, flooding, and combined sewer issues. The resulting park included a 2.5-acre detention pond, but also a playground, skate park, amphitheater, and various other amenities that make it a kind of signature destination public space. It's also worth noting that the park is situated along the Beltline project and serves as a destination node, a sort of public space destination along that corridor. And it was really by leveraging the stormwater system capacity of the new park that the relationship of the Beltline and the relationship to the Beltline network that this park came to be. So this is reflected in the capital stack for this project. You can see a good chunk of both the Beltline tax allocation district that was established and from the Atlanta Department of Watershed Management. So as we've seen in all of these signature projects, philanthropy provides a significant contribution. So these are our signature projects. I'm going to pass it back over to Ami to talk about the neighborhood and the connective scale projects.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. That was great. As noted, I'm going to take us through our last two typologies of projects. And just to give you a sense, these are very different in nature, right? We heard about those high investment, really kind of marquee signature public spaces. Those often have a mix of public-private money going into them. The connective projects, these are linear and these are linear projects that link more than two neighborhoods, and often these are fitting within a much wider transportation network. And so for the purpose of this study, we took just a single phase of a given project so that we could really kind of discretely understand that capital stack. But just to note, we also see a greater level of public investment in these connective projects and a leveraging of transportation and infrastructure funding channels. So, the first project that we're going to take you through is the Midtown Greenway in Minneapolis. And this segment of the Midtown Greenway is a 5.5-mile corridor that runs, it connects to a wider system that runs through Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this was 16 years in the making. There's extremely robust community-driven support for this project that's been built over a series of decades of generations. And so the entity is known as the Midtown Greenway Coalition, a very well-regarded entity, and they really serve as a champion for this project. And so this, again, connects to this wider regional network of trails, but we also see in the list of partners shown here on the first side of the card. But then if we go to the funding side of the card, we can also see the number of different public sources that go into a project like this. So again, most of these connective projects are mostly public funded. We see a little philanthropic contribution on this phase of the Greenway, which we'll see in a couple different projects as well. But generally, you can understand that the buy-in through federal level highway funds, county level support, all the way down to a locally passed local parks bond shows that multi-layer investment of this public infrastructure. And so, this is a great example for a city, right? As Nick mentioned, all of these projects have a story in and of themselves, but we also have to take their context into consideration. So in Minneapolis, this project kind of spotlights how public buy-in really can support long-term capital coordination across these levels of government with a whole kind of culture that respects this kind of investment. So if we move east, our next project is west. We're moving far westward to Phoenix. The Grand Canalscape is a 12-mile multi-use trail that is along a historic canal corridor that runs through the city of Phoenix. And this was revitalized through a partnership between the city of Phoenix and the Salt River Project, which is a nonprofit utility entity. And so we see again this is a publicly funded project, but we see these partnerships result in public amenities like this 12-mile stretch that took 4 years to complete and has a $22 million investment alongside this piece of water infrastructure. So if we look at the capital stack of a project like this, again, in Phoenix, we see less input than we did in Minneapolis, but we still see that interagency coordination show up through a federal Tiger grant, money from the city municipality, from the streets department, and a key chunk of money coming from that nonprofit partner, the Salt River Project's aesthetic program. So again, we see these partnerships in action, but when we looked at Minneapolis, those inputs from so many levels of government show a partnership story. So part of this research, as Nick mentioned, we unearthed more questions than we answered. And in the process of developing these case study cards to really understand each project, we also found we needed some pieces of contextualizing to understand what else was going on in these 9 cities. So one of these pieces that we looked at is trying to understand the governance structure and the decisions that go into making park funding choices. So as you'll recall, we saw in that connective project from Minneapolis, all of those levels of buy-in from the federal, county, down to the local and philanthropic community. Well, we started to wonder if there is any relationship or what the context is for providing those types of public funding resources. And so many of you are likely aware in Minneapolis, there is an independent parks board that was established in the 1800s, and they have the ability to levy a tax themselves, whereas most of the other Parks and Rec departments in the other 8 cities of this study, they sit a bit lower down on the org chart with a few more points of decision making before a choice is made. So again, this is not a causation, but we just wanted to understand correlations between where Parks Department or managing entities sat within a city, and then what that looks like on the ground with these types of project investments. So the last connective project that we're going to share is over further west in Portland. This is the South Waterfront Greenway. And while this is just a quarter-mile trail, it has a significant budget of $15.1 million that was put in over 12-year period. This project is a major anchor along a wider green space network in Portland and was part of a really big, significant brownfield redevelopment initiative along the Willamette River. And so with so many, of course, we also understand as practitioners and as leaders yourselves, there's a big price tag that comes along with that kind of environmental remediation, as well as putting in a significant piece of new infrastructure like this. And there's also a lot of riverbank restoration and riparian habitat focus of this project. So when we look at the funding stack for a 12-year project like this, we start to see again a reflection of a point in time in this city's development culture. And this project is really driven by real estate development pressure. We see most of the funding, again, 100% funded project, as we've seen most of these connective projects have layers of public investment. And here, the bulk of our funding stack is coming from a tax increment finance district around this project, as well as exacted development fees. So again, we think prime real estate, development right on the water, this really dirty piece of land that's cleaned up through high investment and becomes this huge asset for the city, right? But again, it's speaking to that driver of the project. So our final typology that we're going to take you through is that smaller scale neighborhood project. These are a little more local oriented toward local residents. They're more modest in budget. And part of the criteria that we picked for selecting these projects was a mix of 3 different site amenities. So it's not just a playground space, but there's at least 3 different pieces of program happening. So our first project is in Philadelphia, where Nick and I are both, well, we're not currently there, but we both reside there. And this is the Centennial Commons project, has heavy philanthropic investment, and this is part of a coalition of philanthropies that have come together to build a project called Reimagining the Civic Commons. So this project in Philadelphia was one of their, Philadelphia was a pilot city, and this project in particular was a pilot project of that coalition to understand how the philanthropic community can drive community engagement and community co-creation of high quality public spaces. So we see this 1.5-acre sort of front porch designed park that's on the edge of a historic park in Philadelphia, Fairmount Park, $5 million investment over the course of 4 years. When we look at the capital stack of this project, we can see that reflection, right? The Reimagining the Civic Commons, 2 of the major investors in that coalition are the Knight Foundation, and here in the Pennsylvania region in Philadelphia is the William Penn Foundation. So we can see that their contributions make up the bulk of this capital stack, but then we also do see some buy-in from the city to really understand that there is partnership buy-in and that the city is on board with this. So the next neighborhood project is in St. Louis, Strauss Park, this small plaza space. This is a 0.6-acre triangle plaza that sits within the Grand Center Arts District in St. Louis. And it was built it really came to life through community organizing around this arts vision within this arts district. And so it's a modest budget, right? We said not to be afraid of our high budget investment in our signature Texas project. This anchors our lowest budget project at $200,000 over the course of 2 years. And I think it's important to note here, if we look at the capital stack in quotations, this is one of two projects in our entire study that has a single funder. Mostly we're seeing a mix of private and public sources. Again, we saw in those connective projects, it's a lot of public funders from different levels of government. We see here, right, a single private investor. There's no public money that went into this project. And so, again, this is an important point to understand the context of a city. We have corporate philanthropy here through Southwest Airlines through their Heart of the Community grant project that was about placemaking in arts. But we also know like there's a very heavy investment culture of philanthropy in St. Louis. So just keep that in mind, right? How each of these projects, as Nick shared, is a reflection of a wider culture and a context. And as we go through our final example, this is our final neighborhood park in Oakland, California. This is Splash Pad Park, that again is fairly small. It's a 1 acre park, originally built in the early 1990s, and it fell into extreme disrepair through a lack of ongoing well-funded maintenance and operations. And so there was a huge local effort, a community-driven effort to advocate for the revitalization of this space. And they ultimately were successful. They were able to hire Walter Hood to do a beautiful redesign of this space. And again, when we look at the capital stack of this 1 acre project, we see this buy-in from the city, from the local municipality in Oakland is putting the bulk of this investment in from their general fund. But very importantly, we see that community fundraising grant there in the capital stack, which is showing, right, this was driven by the community. They said we need a higher level of care in our parks. We want to have this investment, but we want to make sure this doesn't happen again. And so seeing the power of that showing up in this funding stack really shows, how far advocacy can go to align public investment with neighborhood needs. So the last point, as I've mentioned a few times, right, these are all such compelling stories. These are not selected to be the forerunning most innovative park examples. These are meant to be typical examples of projects in these 9 cities. And of course, we also have explained we can't understand a project just looking at the project itself. We have to understand the context that it operates within, both politically and culturally. And so this is one of the supporting card decks Nick mentioned, that's really looking at the municipal scale of public park investment per capita. So again, in the 3 neighborhood projects we looked at, these cities, Philadelphia, St. Louis, and Oakland, they anchor our lower end of the spectrum of public per capita spending. Across our 9 cities, you'll see Minneapolis anchors us over here on the higher end. And you'll recall the org chart where they have that independently elected parks board that sits high up on the org chart. And so I'll just call your attention to cities like Philadelphia and St. Louis. Of course, St. Louis, by comparison, has a lower population, but a lower operating budget as well. And almost 50% of the park investment in this city, shown here in light yellow, is coming from private sources. And so you'll recall that neighborhood park that we saw that was funded entirely by the Heart of the Community Southwest Airlines investment, philanthropy. We start to see, right, some relationships. Again, these are not causal, but there is that was part of our thinking, is that understanding the context of these cities, how they allocate money toward public space investment, and how that shows up in built projects. So that's just a snapshot of 9 of the 27 case studies that we've built out through this research. Again, you see in the bottom left here, there's 27 different case study cards, but we have these other 4 supporting card decks that help to understand and collect and contextualize those projects. So this resulted in, again, 64 discrete cards. And, this is just a piece. This is kind of one output of this wider body of research. But again, we have found that this research, this national survey of public space projects, allows us to take a higher level view at what other cities are doing and then use it as a tool to have conversations like the one we're about to step into to understand what others are doing, but really how this lands down at the local level and what's going on in your communities. So we really, really want to emphasize that we see this as a tool for facilitating dialogue, but also for asking questions within a framework and being able to sort of see clearly where things are happening and then translate that down to some of the struggles and the successes that you're facing in your communities. I'll also point you to our website. We're online. We have all of this research. This is publicly available. You can download a set of our cards. We would love to talk more if you have questions. We're always available to discuss this research. And if this can be of service in any way to you, we want to get this into your hands. Please feel free also to reach out to us directly. Grace can share our contact information. But with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Grace to close us out, and we can pivot to our next section of discussion.